Her father died before she even knew what it meant to have one. Her mother tried to make a life with another man, but when that mother passed, the stepfather turned cruel. He drank, he beat her, and in the end, he sold her like she was no better than livestock. By the summer of 1887, Eliza was only 23 years old, but she carried the weight of a lifetime of sorrow. She had been passed from one pair of hands to another until she no longer believed she belonged anywhere at all. Now she lay half alive in a graveyard that time had forgotten, whispering to no one that she was not clean anymore. If you rode up on that place and saw her there among the dead, would you walk away or would you kneel down? The Llano Estacado had never been kind to men, let alone women. A land so wide and empty it made a man feel small no matter how many years he had spent on horseback. Out here, the sun cooked the life out of the grass. The wind carried dust into your lungs, and even the dead seemed abandoned. That was where Jacob Miller found himself on that day, 47 years old, heading toward the shallow mound where his wife had been buried during the epidemic. He had promised himself it would be just another visit, a quiet moment with the past, but the prairie does not care about promises. He stepped off his horse, hat in his hand, and the silence of that place fell heavy. The graves stretched across the ground like scars, each one a reminder that no one is safe from loss. Jacob knew that truth too well. He was not looking for anything except the small comfort of standing where his wife had been laid. But the land had other plans. At first he thought it was a bundle of old rags. Folks dumped things anywhere out here, figuring the wind would carry it off. But then the bundle moved. A sound came out, faint but sharp enough to stop him in his tracks. Jacob's hand went to his rifle, but what he saw next made his breath catch. It was a girl, her face pale against the dust, her body bruised and torn. She clung to a piece of cloth like it was the only thing she had left in the world. When her lips moved, the words barely made it out, but Jacob heard them clear. "I'm not clean anymore." Those words were not about dirt or blood, and they were about something deeper, something broken in her soul. Jacob felt it hit him straight in the chest, 'cause he too had lived with a kind of emptiness that stripped a man down to nothing. Losing his wife had hollowed him out. Now here was this young woman left among the dead, already believing she had no worth left. He could have turned away. No one would have known. No one would have blamed him. But the prairie was still. The graves all around seemed to lean in as if waiting for his decision. Jacob Miller had come to remember his wife, and instead he'd found a stranger abandoned to the same silence. And he knew right then that his choice in that moment would change everything. Jacob stayed kneeling there beside the girl, unsure of what to do next. She was trembling like a newborn calf caught out in the cold. But there was a stubborn spark in her eyes. He poured a little water from his canteen and held it to her lips. She drank slow, as if every swallow hurt. After a long silence, she began to speak, her voice breaking apart like dry wood snapping. Her real father had died when she was just a little girl. Her mother remarried, but hoping for stability, but the man she chose turned out to be nothing but poison. When the mother passed, and that stepfather showed his true face, he hit Eliza. He cursed her, and in the end, he sold her like she was nothing more than a sack of beans at the trading post. She ran when she got the chance, but running on the frontier rarely meant freedom. 2 men caught her. They beat her, used her for their own purpose, then left her wrapped in cloth out among the graves to finish dying. Jacob felt the weight of her words settle into him. He knew cruelty. He had seen it in men who let greed rule their hands. But hearing it from her lips, here of all places, made his blood run hot. Then came the sound, a crunch of dirt under boots. Jacob turned his head, and there he was, a man stepping into the graveyard with a smirk stretched across his face, eyes locked on Eliza like she was already his again. "Well, now," the man drawled, "look what we got here. Thought I left you for the coyotes." Jacob rose to his feet, every inch of him tensed. He did not trade words. His hand slid to his rifle, and the air between them grew heavy. The man reached for his gun, but he was slower. The crack of Jacob's Winchester tore through the silence, echoing across the plains. The man stumbled, clutching his shoulder where the bullet tore through. He spat, cursed, and with wild eyes he staggered back toward the brush. "This ain't over, old man. You hear me? This ain't over." Then he vanished into the dust, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Jacob lowered his rifle, chest rising and falling hard. He looked back down at Eliza, who stared at him, not with gratitude, but with something like disbelief. No one had ever stood up for her before, and now a stranger had risked his life in the middle of a graveyard full of ghosts. Jacob knew the shot he had fired was not the end of it. Wounded animals always come back meaner. That man would not stay gone. He would come back, and he would bring trouble. The only question was when. And here's the part you have to ask yourself. If you were in Jacob's boots, would you take her with you back to your ranch, knowing it might bring danger right to your doorstep? Or would you ride away and let her fate be her own? Jacob knew the graveyard was no place to linger. He lifted Eliza gently, felt how light she was in his arms, and carried her to his horse. She did not fight him, only clung to the cloth around her like it was all she had left. He pulled off his own coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It hung loose, far too big, but it was warm, and it smelled of leather and smoke. For the first time in a long while, she let herself rest against someone instead of pushing them away. The ride back was slow. Jacob's eyes scanned the horizon the whole way, waiting for that wounded outlaw to return with a rifle, but the plains were quiet. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had dropped low and the sky was painted in red. Jacob slid from the saddle, lifted Eliza down, and carried her inside. His ranch house was plain, built from rough timber, but it was shelter and it was safe. He laid her down in the room that had once belonged to his wife. For a moment he stood in the doorway, torn by memories, but then he reminded himself this girl had nowhere else to go. He set a pot on the stove, boiled water, and cleaned her wounds with hands that were rough from years of ranch work, but steady as a doctor's. She winced but did not cry. Jacob respected that kind of grit. Over the next day he gave her small bowls of broth, coaxed her to drink water, and let her rest. Each time she stirred awake, she saw that coat of his draped across her, and she held it tighter. It was as if she wanted to believe the world could still offer protection, even if only through a stranger's kindness. For Jacob, those quiet hours stirred something he thought he had buried with his wife. Not romance, not yet, but a reason to keep someone alive other than himself. He had lived too long in silence. Now, for the first time in years, he felt the ranch breathe it again. And I'll tell you, folks who love stories of the Old West, these moments of fragile peace always come before the storm. The land never lets you hold on to quiet for too long. So if you're curious to see what happens when trouble rides back into this ranch, make sure you stay with this story. And if you enjoy hearing tales like this one, you might consider subscribing, because what comes next is worth the ride. For a few days, the ranch felt like a different world. Eliza rested. Jacob kept watch. And the silence of the plains almost convinced him the trouble had passed, but peace out here never lasted. Men like the ones who hurt her did not forget. Wounded pride and greed always come back around. It was late afternoon when Jacob first noticed the signs. The chickens were restless, the dog would not settle, and the wind carried the faint sound of hooves. He set down the bucket of water he was hauling and walked slowly back to the house. His rifle leaned against the door frame, always close by. Eliza was inside, wearing his coat, still watching him through the window with wide eyes that told him she sensed it, too. Then the riders appeared, two of them, pushing hard across the dry field, dust rising behind like a storm. Jacob's jaw tightened. He recognized the man he had shot days earlier, his arms still bound in a dirty sling. The other was bigger, meaner looking, and both carried rifles across their saddles. They were not coming for talk. Jacob stepped inside and told Eliza in a low voice to stay back no matter what. She nodded, but her hands clutched the coat tighter, as if the cloth alone could keep her safe. He grabbed extra cartridges and loaded his Winchester with calm, steady movements. He had been in fights before, and he knew panic never saved a man. The riders pulled up near the corral and shouted his name. "Miller, you got something that belongs to us. Send her out, and maybe we'll let you live to see another sunrise." Jacob stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, hat pulled low. "The only thing you'll take from this place is lead." The air went still for a moment, then gunfire split the silence. Bullets chewed into the wooden posts. Glass shattered behind him, and Jacob dropped to one knee, returning fire. His first shot caught the smaller man's horse in the leg, sending the animal down in a scream of dust and fury. The outlaw rolled off, cursing, and fired wild. Jacob shifted, aimed again, and the second shot clipped the man's thigh, spinning him into the dirt. The larger outlaw dismounted, yelling, and fired toward the house. One round tore through Jacob's shoulder, knocking him back against the porch. He gritted his teeth and forced himself up, blood seeping down his shirt. Inside the house, Eliza could hear every shot. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she grabbed the revolver Jacob had left on the table. She had never fired at a man before, but rage boiled up inside her, hotter than fear. She opened the door just enough to see the larger outlaw charging forward. With trembling hands, she raised the pistol, squeezed the trigger, and the man dropped hard into the dust. The silence after that shot was heavier than the fight itself. Smoke drifted across the yard. The wounded outlaw, the same one Jacob had shot back at the graveyard, stared at Eliza with wide eyes. For the first time, his grin was gone. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his bleeding leg, and stumbled away toward the horizon. Jacob leaned against the porch rail, pain burning through his shoulder, but his eyes never left Eliza. She stood frozen in the doorway, gun still in her hand, breathing hard. The coat he had given her flapped in the wind, and in that moment she did not look like a broken girl left to die. She looked like someone who had just reclaimed her own life. Jacob whispered through the blood and dust, "It's over for now." But out here, nothing stays quiet forever. And that is the question I would put to you watching this tale unfold. If you had just fired that shot, if you had just defended your own life for the first time, would you feel relief, or would you know deep down that trouble might come knocking again tomorrow? That question is why you need to see what happens next. The yard was quiet again, except for the ringing in Jacob's ears and the sound of Eliza's ragged breath. The smoke from the rifles hung low, curling in the summer heat before the wind carried it away across the plains. One man lay dead in the dust. The other had vanished into the horizon, and standing in the doorway with his coat wrapped tight around her and a pistol still in her hand, Eliza was no longer the same girl Jacob had found among the graves. Jacob sank down onto the porch steps, pressing his hand against the wound in his shoulder. The pain was sharp, but it was not enough to break him. Eliza dropped the pistol and hurried to his side, her hands shaking as she tried to help. She whispered that she was sorry, that all she ever brought anyone was trouble. Jacob looked her in the eye, steady and calm despite the blood on his shirt, and told her that was not true. Trouble was not who she was. Surviving was. In the days that followed, the ranch became a place of healing. Jacob stitched his shoulders best he could, and Eliza took care of him in return. She fed the animals, swept the porch, and sat with him in the evenings when the prairie stretched quiet under the stars. Slowly, she began to speak not only of the pain she had lived through, but also of the things she still hoped for. She had thought her life was over at 23, but Jacob reminded her with every quiet act that life could begin again at any moment. Then came the day she confessed the truth. With tears in her eyes, she told Jacob she was carrying a child, one that was not his, a shadow left behind by her tormentors. She braced herself for rejection, for the look she'd seen too many times before. But Jacob only reached out, rested his hand over hers, and said, "Then it will be ours now." Those words were heavier than any bullet, yet softer than any prayer. In that moment, Jacob was not just offering her a roof for protection. He was offering her a chance at dignity, at belonging, at family, and Eliza, who once whispered she was not clean anymore, finally believed she could be more than the sum of her wounds. Life on the frontier was never easy, and there would always be dust and danger, and men who thought they could own others. But there was also resilience and choice, and the quiet strength of two people deciding to stand together when the world expected them to fall apart. Now, let me ask you this. If you had been in Jacob's place, would you have taken in a stranger, even knowing the risks, even knowing the scars she carried? And if you were Eliza, would you have had the courage to trust again after everything had been torn from you? Stories like this remind us that sometimes the hardest battles are not fought with rifles or revolvers, but with the decision to keep going, to keep caring, even when the past tells you to quit. If this story moved you, if you believe the Old West still has lessons worth hearing, I invite you to give this video a like so others can find it too. And if you want to hear more tales of the frontier, stories of love, loss, justice, and re-redemption, then subscribe to this channel and stay with us. Tell cuz out here on the plains there are always more stories waiting to be